Okay, next I'd like to talk about sort of the post-Soviet Union era. So we talked about the Russian Revolution in 1917 that turned the Russian Empire into the Soviet Union. And we can describe a second Russian Revolution that occurred in 1991. So know that time period, around 1990 to 1992. Even if you don't know it exactly, just know it's around 1990 because a lot is happening around this time. And in 1991, you have the collapse or the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And what was the Soviet Union now becomes 15 new countries, one being Russia. And then the other, again, remember there was a collection of Soviet or socialist republics, and these republics become independent during that breakup. So we've talked about in Europe centripetal forces and centrifugal forces, things that hold countries together, encourage supranationalism, and things that pull countries apart. And at the end of the Cold War, what happened is that the centrifugal forces were more powerful than what was holding these countries together. So there was economic troubles, there was, countries wanted to have greater autonomy and freedom, greater devolutionary forces among the parts of the Soviet Union, causing them to break away into their own independent countries. So in the place of the Soviet Union now, you have a mix of two things. The dominant country, the Russian Republic, becomes now the Russian Federation. And the idea was it was to become a federal system like the United States or Canada, with more local control, but over time it's really changed into more of a unitary state system. And unitary means that the control really lies within the central federal government. And this has really happened under Vladimir Putin, who's really taken greater amount of control over the country. One example that the governors of these different parts of the Russian Federation at one time were elected, and now they're appointed by Vladimir Putin. So that's one way of exerting greater amount of control over these various parts. So they're not exactly states, but there are kind of these different levels of semi-autonomous regions within the Russian Federation. They go by different names, but we can kind of skip that level of detail, but just know that there's sort of these very different levels of what are kind of like states or territories in Russia. And the other part, the other 14 countries become what's called the near abroad. The near abroad is a term that describes the former socialist republics that were part of the Soviet Union that are now independent countries. And there's 14 of them. I'd like you to know that it broke into 14 republics and 15 if you include Russia. The near abroad, which is the ones that are not Russia, there are 14 of them. That includes the Central Asian countries that are in this chapter, the 3 Transcaucasian republics, which are in this chapter, and then the rest are Eastern European countries that are in the previous chapter, but we're going to discuss here. Here's a closer view of in Transcaucasia. You have Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. But you also have some Russian republics across the way here, like Dagestan, Chechnya. Some of these also want to become independent, but they've been held back from becoming independent because Russia has maintained control over them, even despite them violent struggles to become independent. We're going to talk a little bit more about that as well. Okay, so we have Russia and we have the near abroad, and one term I want to introduce here is called revanchism. And these are policies to try to recover lost territory. And this has been a theme recently under Russia, where Russia has tried to take back, in one way or the other, parts of the old Soviet Union. And we'll see some examples of that as we go, particularly in the country of Ukraine. Okay, so here is generally I'm going to divide the near abroad into 3 general areas. One, the Central Asian republics. one, Transcaucasia, the three, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, and then also the Eastern European part. Okay, so again, just to recap, in the post-Soviet era, the USSR splits into 15 countries, the Russian Federation and 14 other independent countries. Now, some of these, all but 3 of these, join what's called the CIS, or Commonwealth of Independent States. This is something like the European Union, but it is a supranationalist organization of post-Soviet countries. Now, 3 of the former Soviet republics don't. They actually joined the European Union and also joined NATO. We'll highlight those in a moment. Those are Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Call these the Baltic republics because they're up here near the Baltic Sea. So Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, that they didn't really retain ties to Russia when the Soviet Union broke up. They chose instead to align themselves with Western Europe. And so they joined the European Union, and they've also joined NATO. So these are, remember that NATO was sort of on the other side of the Cold War. So this is quite a move from being part of the Soviet Union to now being part of the Western aligned or NATO countries. And we'll talk about some of the tensions of that in a moment, including this one piece of geography that we haven't mentioned yet, but this is a piece of Russia that sits outside of Russia called Kaliningrad, and we'll highlight that in a moment. Okay, so again, we have, Central Asia, Transcaucasia, and Eastern Europe. Let's start by highlighting Eastern Europe again. Okay, so the 3 countries we mentioned, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, they were part of the Soviet Union, as well as these 3 countries, Belarus, Ukraine, and Moldova. 3 of these, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, become more aligned with the West. They join the European Union and also join NATO, where the situation is a little more complicated for Belarus, Ukraine, and Moldova. And what complicates us even further is an exclave of Russia called Kaliningrad. I'm going to include a YouTube video that highlights Kaliningrad and talks about some of the military and political difficulties of having this exclave. And it is a kind of a powerful military base that sits right in the middle of these NATO countries. So here's another view of it. This is the Kaliningrad exclave. And at the same time, you have these NATO countries, including Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, the Baltic republics, as well as Poland. And that further cuts off this exclave of Kaliningrad. Now, in the remaining 3 countries, Belarus, Ukraine, and Moldova, these have bigger Russian minorities, so it's more difficult for them to completely leave. In some ways, then they are kind of split between Russia and Europe, especially Ukraine. So if you remember this term called Russification, this was a policy where Russia moved significant amount of people who are ethnically Russian and spoke Russian into these Eastern European countries like Ukraine and Belarus. So this is from the previous chapter, but if you look at Belarus and Ukraine, even Moldova, and you see these kind of brown patches, these are areas where you have significant Russian minorities in the country, and this is partially a result of this policy of Russification. So here we can highlight again, you have Moldova, and in Moldova you have Transnistria, this little piece here with a large Russian population. In Ukraine, especially in the east, you have a large Russian population. And Belarus is kind of dependent on Russia, so both economically and ethnically, is more aligned with Russia. So these three countries are have kind of a mix of ties to Russia, but also in some cases want to be more aligned with the West. Especially the country of Ukraine. And Ukraine is a good case study to highlight this, that if you look at the European Union states here and Russia here, you can see that Ukraine really sits right in the middle of these two kind of opposite entities here. And we've mentioned devolutionary forces before, and Ukraine is one place where there are strong devolutionary forces in the country because of that split of the eastern part, where you have, this is the number of Russian speakers. You can see it's extremely high in percentage of Russian speakers in the east, especially in the Crimean Peninsula. One thing you'll notice if you look at the maps in the book, it shows the Crimea as part of Russia. That didn't historically exist. That's something that happened fairly recently. So in other words, you have a lot of Russian speakers in the east and a lot of people who are more ethnically Ukrainian or more aligned with other European countries in the West. This is the result of a presidential vote where you had a pro-Russian candidate shown in red, and you had a pro-Western or European Union candidate shown in blue. And you can see kind of like this red state, blue state maps. We have the pro-European candidate got all the votes really here in the West, and the pro-Russian candidate more in the East. So there's a real, not just ethnic split, but also political split in Ukraine. And a lot of this came to a head around 2014 when you had a revolution in the country, and the Russian-backed president who was the president was overthrown. And at the same time, you had a piece of Ukraine's territory that was seized by Russia by force. It came in with navy and military power and actually annexed the Crimean Peninsula. This is the Crimean Peninsula down here. And this isn't a good example of revanchism, or the Russia taking back territory that was once part of the Soviet Union. And I'm going to show a video that will kind of highlight a little more deep on this, on the Crimean Peninsula, the revolution that took place. And there's a lot of things in the news recently about Ukraine and it's needing defense and help from the United States, and a lot of it goes back to what's happening in 2014. So, well, some of this is actually kind of reappearing in the news more recently. Okay, but let's move on ahead to Central Asia, and I'll include some other video material that talks more about Ukraine and gives you more in-depth information. So one thing about Central Asia is that, here's a closer view of it. If you look at the names of the country, they all end in stan. So these are collectively called the stans: Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan. The term stan it comes from Persian, which is somewhat related to European languages. So if you notice, in Europe, you have countries that end in land, like Ireland, England, Finland. And stan is kind of a similar thing, where it is an ending that means land of. So this means like Kazakh land, or land of the Kazakhs, Kazakhstan, land of the Uzbeks, land of the Kyrgyz, and so on. So these are collectively known as the stans. And one thing about them is that they've historically been quite isolated, especially during the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union, that originally they didn't even have firm political borders. It was mostly inhabited by nomadic people who moved around. There weren't strong political borders. Some of the borders were superimposed by the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union. But now that they're becoming independent countries, they're starting to become more integrated with the global economy. And that's for two reasons. One is that there's been discoveries of oil and gas in many of these places, especially around this area of the Caspian Sea. So there's new mineral resources that are being exploited by these stan countries. And the second is something called the New Silk Road. And this is a new transportation link, a project by China to link East Asia with Western Europe. And China has a project called the Belt and Road Project that includes a rail line that connects through Central Asia all the way to Europe. And Central Asian countries like Kazakhstan are becoming a hub of transportation on the Asian continent. So this is the old Silk Road. If you remember your history, this is historically the transportation route between East and West, usually by camel trains or some other form of transportation that was pretty slow, but it was the one way you got goods back and forth. The New Silk Road, on the other hand, is really rail links and also freeways that China is developing to connect China all the way into Europe. The figure in the book is a little out of date because the rail line actually goes all the way to London now. There's a tunnel underneath the ocean, underneath the sea, that gets you from France to United Kingdom. So this is called the Korgos Gateway here in Kazakhstan, and the Soviet-era rail lines are a different size than rail lines in other parts of the world like China. So this is actually an inland port where goods have to be moved from one type of a train to the other to continue on their route across Central Asia into Europe. I'll post a video on that as well. One thing I want to highlight about Central Asia is religious differences. That Central Asia is sort of the northern extent of what we call the Islamic world, that Islam is the dominant religion here. We're going to be discussing Islam more in detail in future lectures, but there are cultural differences such as religious differences. So the Caucasus region as well as Central Asia, Islam is a major religion. There's also linguistic differences, so there are cultural differences between Central Asians and Russians, that there is a different culture, different languages, different religions here. Most of the people here speak what are called Turkic languages in addition to Russian. Here's a photo, just kind of the background image of Tajikistan. One thing you might notice in the background that many of the stand countries are dry and some are fairly mountainous, like you can see in the background here. This is a brand new capital of Kazakhstan, and it reflects some of the new wealth that's being developed in these countries because of mineral resources. That this is a brand new capital that's been built with shiny new buildings and a lot of sort of a business-friendly environment. You can see LG, Coca-Cola, this massive statue that was built. And I'll show a video that highlights that. Okay, let's move ahead to the third part is Transcaucasia. And that includes 3 countries: Georgia. It's hard to, that sounds a lot like one of our states, but it's the same spelling, but it's also, this is the country of Georgia. You also have Armenia and Azerbaijan. And one thing about it is that this area is very mountainous and it's very ethnically complex. That it's not a single unified culture in the Caucasus, but a collection of small pockets of cultures because of the isolation of the mountainous environment. It's a mix of languages and a real mix of religions. This is an area that's very ethnically complex and complicated. So for example, this is showing different religions. You have a type of Christianity is dominant in Georgia. You have a different type of Christianity is dominant in Armenia. One type of Islam called Shia Islam is dominant in Azerbaijan. It's going to be similar to the religion of Iran. And a different kind of Islam called Sunni, which is a more common type, up here in the Russian part, in Dagestan. So in other words, there's kind of a mix not only of Islam and Christianity, but different types of Islam and Christianity. Again, very complicated. This is an ethnic map, and you can see the thing to highlight here is just the complexity of it all. One thing to note are the idea of exclaves. So if you look at Armenia and Azerbaijan, one thing notable is that there's a piece of Azerbaijan over here in Armenia and a piece of Armenia over here in Azerbaijan, that each country has a piece of its territory that sits within the other. This has led to conflict over time between the two countries. The other thing I'll note about Georgia here is devolutionary forces are very strong in Georgia, that there are certain parts of Georgia that have attempted to break away and realign themselves with Russia. So there are some parts like Abkhazia here that want to be independent. It's whether they're independent or not depends on which countries recognize them. Some countries do, some countries don't. But this is South Ossetia and some others that there are pockets of here where they're attempting to kind of realign themselves with Russia. And in fact, there have been wars where Russia and Georgia have been in conflict over some of these territories. Again, another example of revanchism, by the way. So here, this is highlighting some of these: South Ossetia, Abkhazia. This is the capital of Abkhazia, and if you look closely at it, it's all shot up. And this has happened during one of the conflicts between Georgia and Russia, and they left the capital all shot up, just sort of as a symbol of what had happened there.